When you're planning for an IFR flight, you have the same considerations you'd have for a VFR flight. You want your flight to be safe and comfortable for you and your passengers, and you want to be legal. But since, by definition, you're likely to be doing an IFR flight in bad weather, you have more things to take into consideration. The FAA has a catch-all clause that says you should become familiar with all available information concerning the flight you're about to take. And that applies to both a VFR and an IFR flight. And the FAA goes further and lists what you must become familiar with for an IFR flight or a VFR flight that goes beyond the vicinity of the local airport. Those items are runway lengths at any airport you're intending to use, takeoff and landing distance data in your airplane flight manual, weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, known ATC delays, and alternatives if you can't complete your planned flight. Now, where are you going to look for this stuff? Most of the same places you've been using for your VFR flights. You'll just want to glean a little more out of them for IFR. They include the current AFD, complete pre-flight briefing either from a flight service station or DUATs, current IFR charts, and don't forget about the area charts if you're going to one of those 12 busy areas they cover, and current VFR charts. When the FAA asks you to become familiar with the runway lengths and takeoff and landing performance data, they obviously want you to know that you can safely take off and land at the airports you're going to use. But in IFR conditions, you'll want to carry that a little farther. Ask yourself questions like, can I stop on that runway when it's wet and I have a tailwind? Or is there any hint of ice or snow on the runway? When you're looking at alternatives, you'll first want to consider what you'll do if you have an emergency immediately after takeoff. What runways have the best minimums and are the easiest to reach from your departure route? Your best choices may not be at your departure airport. Once you've picked your route, look for the airports along the way that are color-coded to show they have instrument approaches, the blue and green airports on the NOS charts. By the way, if your route goes near the edge of your chart, make sure you carry along the adjacent chart, and that also applies to the approach plates. Then, look at your options at your destination airport. What if you're next in line for the approach and the guy ahead of you is sitting on the runway with a blown tire? Or there's a very strong crosswind to your planned runway? Or the approach nav aid for your first choice suddenly goes toes up? Do you have other runway and or approach choices at this airport? But what if you can't land at your destination airport? What's your second choice, your third? For an IFR flight, the usual reason you can't land at your destination is that the weather has deteriorated below the approach minimums. So when you're choosing alternate airports, you'll want to look for those likely not to be under the same weather influences as your destination. Also, look downwind for an alternate to see if you can find a candidate for an alternate where you don't have to beat into a wind to get there. By the same token, if you'll be flying in high terrain, look for alternate airports that might be at a lower elevation. In other words, look for candidate alternates that are downwind and downhill. But any choices you make at this point are preliminary until you get your pre-flight weather briefing. For the typical cross-country, you'll likely see several possible routes to choose from. And what you learn from your weather preview may make one route a clear choice over the others or a clear non-choice. Here are some things to consider when you have choices. In certain areas, MEAs play a strong factor in route selection, especially if you're flying in the mountains. You'll want to consider your airplane's performance at high MEAs, where the freezing levels are, if there's turbulence and downdrafts, and oxygen requirements. Now, you already know about picking preferred routes. Picking a preferred route can, in some cases, save you a lot of time. When there's a high-density traffic area along your route, you may avoid delays or out-of-the-way vectors by choosing a route around it. If there are DPs and stars appropriate for your departure and destination airports, you'll want to include them in your plan, especially since you'll probably get them in your clearance anyway. If there's no star, use a feeder route that connects to the approach you expect to fly, if one fits. I think you'll agree that the FAA's idea of becoming familiar with all available information is a good idea for your IFR flights. In fact, you've probably been doing that all along for your VFR flights, but now you'll want to pay special attention to those factors that apply to IFR flying.